In 1876, Amos and Annie Curtis Bowman reached Fidalgo Island. Amos surveyed the waterfront. He liked what he saw.
On examining the harbor for terminal purposes, which was the first work I did here, I was agreeably surprised to find every condition around Anacortes Place nearly perfect. And in the spring of 1877, I purchased it from Miss Maud Stevens of Boston, a sister of General Hazard Stevens, for the sum of $1,000.
Amos was a visionary. He could see a town carved from the forest, a big town.
Amos Bowman described it as it was going to be the New York of the West. And when they laid out the city, they laid it out to be the same size as the city of Boston.
If he was a visionary, he was also a romantic. He named the town of his dreams after the woman he loved, Annie Curtis. There are conflicting stories about how it came to be called Anacortes.
One story is that the Anacortes, he just corrupted it, modified it to a certain extent to fit in with the Fidalgo Island, the Spanish influence.
Or maybe it was a typo.
It was thought that Amos was going to name the city Annie Curtis, and in communicating with the Postal Department in Washington, D.C., they thought because of the Spanish influence through here, it was Anacortes, and that was the way it came, and it stayed forevermore. That's the legend of how it got the name Anacortes rather than Anacortes.
Old timers, when I came out here, were still referring to this town as Anacortes.
Anacortes was an ideal destination for the sailing ships that rode the prevailing westerlies the length of the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the deep protected waters of the Guaymas Channel. Amos visualized a world-class port where sail met rail on land he just happened to own.
He was surveying for the Canadian Railroad. He was a mining engineer, surveyor, reporter, very versatile, and apparently very charismatic.
Well, there was always a rumor that Anacortes, because of its seaport, was a strong possibility to become a terminus for a railroad line.
Amos took advantage of the power of the press to promote his grandiloquent vision of the New York of the West, the Manhattan of the Pacific.
And he established the town's first newspaper, the Northwest Enterprise, which he used as a tool to communicate with the power brokers throughout the nation.
Amos was entirely in favor of advocacy journalism. One of his most celebrated journalistic feats was the publication of a map.
He made an incredible map, and that was circulated through the media of his newspaper all around the country. Any place where he thought there might be someone interested in Anacortes as a site for an industry or a rail line.
Amos just was able to convince all these people that this was just the most perfect location for everything.
Amos Bowman realized that we were kind of sitting in the catbird seat, and there was a map that came out in 1890 when he was making his big push for Anacortes that showed Anacortes as being 1/16 of an inch off being dead center in the planet.
He offered half his land to any person or business that would follow his dream. In 1888, the Oregon Improvement Company accepted his proposal and announced plans to build a railroad. By 1890, the public had bought the Bowman dream.
In January of 1890, there were only about 30 or 40 people in Anacortes. By March, there were probably about 3,000 people here, based on the speculation that this was going to become the terminus for the Transcontinental Railroad. And a railroad was built to this place, and in August of 1890, the first train came.
Hit a black train coming, better get your business right.
The local boosters worked overtime to sell their imagined city. Every day, steamships from Seattle and Tacoma deposited new customers on Bowman's Wharf.
I mean, people came in, they came up by boat, bought their land, stayed for 10 or 12 hours, and went back.
Two of the principal businesses they had in town at that time were real estate offices and saloons.
The first order of business was to clear the dense forests that covered the prospective town site.
The saying was that you could see the fires of the trees that were being burned here as far north as Bellingham and as far south as Everett.
To a writer who visited Anacortes in March of 1890, It was a hellish scene.
Thousands of burning stumps sent forth great clouds of smoke that floated far over the straits. At night, these fires were constantly watched and attended by hundreds of laborers. This scene presented a curious picture. The landscape seemed a lake of fire through which the figures of men were constantly moving, reminding one of the scenes in the Inferno.
In the words of another observer, that was the heroic age of Anacortes. Those beautiful solitudes extending from Cap Santa to Deception Pass, upon which a few farmers, lumbermen, storekeepers, and steamboatmen had been carrying on a tough, substantial trade, became suddenly transformed into one of the most typical of all typical Western boom towns, where the boomer boomed, the promoter promoted, the gambler gambled, the grafter grafted, and the sucker sucked. The heroic age was short-lived. The train that appeared in August came north from Seattle, not west from New York. It sparked a celebration among the Anacortesans, but it wasn't the transcontinental union of Amos Bowman's imagination.
Towards the end of 1890, there was a panic and the accompanying crash, and several of the railroads went out of business. They were failures, and that was about November of 1890 was the time that people began to take a look at their whole card and wondering if Anacortes truly was the city of destiny.
The local railroadmen had been endeavoring to lay railroad tracks to the east, toward the North Cascades.
They managed to get about 33 miles from here, and then the Oregon Improvement Company went bankrupt. They could not get the financing to continue this transcontinental dream, probably because the North Cascades were so formidable and everybody realized that no railroad would go across those mountains.
When the news broke that the Transcontinental Railroad would not terminate at Bowman's Wharf, the bottom fell out of the real estate market. Virtually everybody who had the means to leave Anacortes did so. The Bowmans stayed on until 1894, when Amos died, believing himself a failure. Annie took it hard.
She was absolutely grief-stricken and desolate. A letter to her sister Sally Childs, she expresses her grief in 1901. He died in 1894. That the light had just gone out of her life. She was still mourning, and the unmarked grave here bothered her a great deal because, of course, he didn't leave a lot of cash, a lot of land. So she never really recovered from his death.